Remember those forgotten dinners? So rich and comforting they still make your mouth water? In the 1950s, these meals brought families together around the table night after night. What happened to the flavors we never meant to leave behind? Pork chop casserole with cream of mushroom soup was one of those dinners that made you feel like everything was going to be all right, even when money was tight. You would take thick bone-in pork chops, season them just enough, and then lay them in a casserole dish with canned cream of mushroom soup poured right over the top. That soup turned into the creamiest, most flavorful gravy once it baked, soaking into the meat and anything else in the dish, usually rice or noodles or even thinly sliced potatoes if you had them. Families loved it because it was hearty. It stretched a few pork chops into a full meal, and it had that unmistakable cozy taste that just stuck with you. It was the kind of recipe that showed up on church supper tables and inside handwritten index card boxes passed down through generations. No frills, no fuss, just pork cooked until it was tender enough to cut with a fork and gravy that made you want to lick the plate clean. It is hard to believe a dish this simple and this satisfying ever went out of fashion, but maybe that is why it deserves a place back on our tables today. Baked eggs and ham cups were a clever little way to dress up breakfast for dinner, and they always felt like a special treat no matter how basic the ingredients were. You would take slices of deli ham and press them into muffin tins to make a cup shape, then crack an egg inside each one and bake them until just set. The ham would crisp around the edges, and the egg would stay warm and soft in the center, sometimes with a little shredded cheese or a pinch of paprika on top if you were feeling fancy. It was quick, tidy, and portioned just right. Plus, it looked a lot fancier than it really was. In the 1950s, presentation mattered, even if your meal came from whatever was left in the icebox. Moms could make a dozen of these in one go, and kids never seemed to complain when dinner looked like something from a diner tray. It was meals like these that made it easy to stretch a few eggs and a bit of meat into a whole family supper. Sometimes it really was the simple stuff that left the biggest impression. Beef and biscuit bake was the kind of shortcut comfort food that became a weeknight legend. You would brown some ground beef with onions, stir in a can of gravy or cream soup, and pour the whole mess into a baking dish. Then you would drop spoonfuls of biscuit dough right on top, sometimes made from scratch, sometimes straight from a tube, and bake it until the biscuits puffed up and turned golden. Underneath, that beef and gravy would bubble up just enough to spill into the cracks, soaking the bottoms of those biscuits in all that flavor. It was like pot pie without the work, or shepherd's pie with a country twist. This was the kind of dinner that smelled like home from the second it hit the oven. You would come in from school or work, and that smell would stop you at the door. A lot of moms relied on this because it used ingredients that were cheap, filling, and almost always in the pantry. And nobody walked away hungry. You could even toss in a bag of frozen vegetables if you had them. It was not gourmet, but it did not have to be. It was good. Mock duck was one of those recipes that proved just how much imagination home cooks had in the 1950s. You would take flank steak, which was one of the cheaper cuts of beef, and pound it flat until it could be rolled up like a jelly roll. Then you would fill it with stuffing, usually breadcrumbs, onions, and maybe some celery or sausage if you had it, and tie it up with string before roasting it in the oven. The end result looked like a fancy roasted bird, even though it was really just beef and stuffing. People called it mock duck because the presentation was elegant enough to pass for a holiday dish. That was the charm of it. It made an ordinary cut of meat feel special. It took time and effort, sure, but it was worth it for the way everyone's eyes lit up when it hit the table. You could slice it into rounds and drizzle it with gravy, and suddenly it was not just Tuesday night anymore. It was tradition, it was ingenuity, and it was every bit as delicious as the name promised. Creamed celery with toasted crumbs might sound like a side dish at best, but in the 1950s, it could absolutely be dinner, especially when served over toast or with boiled potatoes. Celery was cheap, plentiful, and easy to grow or buy in bulk, which made it a natural fit for thriftier households. You would sauté it gently in butter until soft, then stir in a white sauce made with flour, milk, and more butter. The mixture would thicken into something rich and velvety, transforming those pale green stalks into something far more satisfying than you would expect. A layer of toasted breadcrumbs on top gave it a crunch that felt almost indulgent. For families on a budget, this dish was a lifesaver. It took a vegetable that usually played backup and gave it the starring role. Creamed celery was warm, savory, and surprisingly hearty. It was the kind of meal you made when money was low and the pantry looked bare, but you still wanted to eat something that felt like home, and more often than not, it hit the spot. Frankfurter goulash was about as American as it gets. Hot dogs and elbow macaroni swimming in a mildly spiced tomato sauce, all cooked in one pot. This was not a fancy European goulash, but it did take a little inspiration from the original. The paprika and onions gave it just enough flavor to feel like something more than just leftovers tossed together. In the 1950s, families were busy and money was tight, so anything that fed a crowd without emptying your wallet was golden. Frankfurter goulash delivered on all fronts. Hot dogs were cheap, pasta stretched far, and that tomato base made it feel like a real meal. Sometimes moms would add a handful of frozen peas or a dash of Worcestershire sauce to punch it up. Other times it was just straight and simple, hot, hearty, and ready in 20 minutes. Kids loved it. Dads cleaned their plates. It was the kind of dinner that did not need a second invitation. It stuck to your ribs and warmed your belly, and that was enough. Savory tomato pudding was the kind of dish that made people do a double take. Pudding, tomato. And yet, somehow it worked. You would take cubes of stale bread and soak them in a mixture of stewed tomatoes, butter, sugar, and seasonings, usually salt, pepper, and maybe a dash of vinegar or cloves. Then you would bake it until the bread soaked up all the juice and turned soft and custardy inside, crisp on top. It was tangy and sweet, with a flavor that sat somewhere between stuffing and bread pudding. In the 1950s, people were used to being creative with pantry staples, and this was a prime example. It was served as a main course in meatless meals or as a side for pork chops and baked beans. The combination might sound strange now, but back then, it was a regular part of the rotation. Tomato pudding showed up in cookbooks and school cafeterias alike, and it never failed to start a conversation. Sometimes the weirdest combinations are the ones that stick with you longest. Ranch-style beans with rice was a hearty plate that brought the spirit of the open range right into suburban kitchens. These beans were slow cooked with chili powder, garlic, onion, and sometimes a little smoked meat or bacon, depending on what you had on hand. The flavor was bold and rich, and serving them over a scoop of fluffy white rice made it feel like something bigger than the sum of its parts. For 1950s, families trying to make ends meet, beans were a budget hero. They were cheap, filling, and could simmer on the stove while the rest of the house ran its evening routine. The rice soaked up every drop of that spiced sauce, turning every bite into comfort on a spoon. Some called it cowboy food, others called it supper. Either way, it was the kind of meal that never let you down. Spaghetti with anchovy butter was not something that showed up on every table, but it had a quiet little following in 1950s kitchens where grown-up tastes took the lead. This was not your classic red sauce spaghetti. Instead, it was hot pasta tossed with a simple mixture of melted butter and mashed anchovies, maybe a little garlic, maybe some parsley. That was it. The anchovies melted right into the butter, creating a salty, savory coating that clung to every noodle. It was bold, it was briny, and it was surprisingly elegant for a dinner that came together in under 15 minutes. This was the kind of dish that showed up when someone wanted something adult, something rich, something with flavor that lingered. It felt like a secret, something too simple to be this good, but too good to keep to yourself. Eggplant hamburger bake was how you got something warm, filling, and full of flavor without using a whole lot of meat. You would slice the eggplant thin and layer it with browned ground beef, onions, tomato sauce, and breadcrumbs, sometimes with a little cheese in between if you had it. Then you would bake the whole thing until the top was golden and bubbling. The eggplant soaked up the sauce like a sponge, and the beef stretched just far enough to flavor the whole dish without stealing the spotlight. In the 1950s, eggplant was starting to show up in more American kitchens, thanks to Italian neighbors and the influence of new cookbooks. It was cheap, hearty, and had a meaty texture all on its own, which made it the perfect partner for ground beef. This was the kind of casserole that worked with what you had and made it feel like more. It might not have been everyone's favorite at first, but once it hit the table, it always got scraped clean. Meat and potato ring mold was one of those dishes that lived on the edge between practicality and pageantry. At first glance, it looked like something you might see at a dinner party. Neatly shaped, carefully sliced, and often centered on a plate with gravy pooling in the middle. But the truth was, it came straight from a place of thrift. Leftover mashed potatoes and beef hash were packed into a gelatin mold, chilled, and then warmed again before serving. It sounds odd by today's standards, but back then, molded dinners were all the rage. They were seen as elegant, efficient, and impressive. The potatoes gave structure, the beef gave protein, and together they made something that could feed a family without stretching the budget. Moms loved it because it could be prepped ahead of time and reheated with no fuss. It was firm enough to slice like a meatloaf and soft enough to melt right into the gravy. Some families even dressed it up with peas, carrots, or tiny cubes of ham, giving it a splash of color and a little extra heartiness. It was dinner and display in one. It was one of those meals that tried to make leftovers feel like something special. And for a lot of households, it did exactly that. Old-fashioned chicken fricassee was comfort food with a little bit of dignity. You would start by browning bone-in chicken pieces in butter or shortening, then cook them slowly in a silky white gravy made from roux, milk, and pan drippings. Toss in some carrots, celery, or peas if you had them, and serve it all over a bed of rice or egg noodles. It was creamy, savory, and warm in a way that felt like a hug on a plate. In the 1950s, it was considered a refined but affordable meal, one that felt a little more special than the usual casseroles or stews. It came from a long line of European country recipes, but was adapted into something uniquely American. Fricassee took time but not a lot of money, which made it perfect for slow Sunday dinners or when company came over. It turned inexpensive chicken cuts into something that felt luxurious. Kids loved it, adults appreciated it, and there was always someone mopping up the last of that gravy with a slice of white bread. Wiener Winks were one of those fun, no-fuss dinners that made kids laugh and adults sigh in relief. You would take slices of sandwich bread, flatten them out just a little, wrap them around hot dogs, brush with melted butter, and bake until golden brown. It was barely a recipe, but somehow it felt like a real treat. Maybe it was the crunch of the toasted bread or the buttery shell that made even a basic hot dog feel new again. In the 1950s, this kind of recipe was prized not just for its taste, but for its ease and presentation. It looked like something from a luncheon tray, but you could whip it up in under 20 minutes using whatever you had in the pantry. Some moms added cheese, mustard, or even a slice of pickle inside for extra flavor. But most of the time, it was just bread and a hot dog, baked into something warm and satisfying. It was simple, it was clever, and it reminded you that dinner did not have to be fancy to be fun. Orange glazed pork chops brought a bright pop of flavor to the usual midweek meal rotation. You would start by broiling or pan-searing thick-cut chops until they had a good crust, then finish them off with a glaze made from orange juice concentrate, a little sugar, and maybe a splash of vinegar or soy sauce. That sweet citrus glaze caramelized around the meat and turned every bite into something sticky, savory, and full of unexpected flavor. It was the kind of meal that looked impressive on a plate, even though it was budget-friendly and easy to make. In the 1950s, recipes like this showed up in women's magazines and community cookbooks as a way to bring a little flair into the kitchen. It felt modern, exotic even. But at its core, it was a way to stretch a small amount of pork into something that tasted big and bold. Served with rice or buttered noodles, it was the perfect balance of sweet and salty, and it made an ordinary dinner feel just a bit like a celebration. Canned fish curry was born out of necessity, but it became a regular fixture in many 1950s homes. The base was usually canned mackerel or sardines, broken into chunks and simmered with onions, canned tomatoes, and a mild curry powder. It was not spicy in the way modern curries can be, but it had enough warmth and depth to give the dish real personality. The smell would fill the kitchen fast, rich, savory, a little tangy, and it went perfectly over hot rice or buttered toast. At the time, curry powder was a novelty in most American kitchens, often marketed as an international flavor. This dish offered a quick and affordable way to feel worldly, even if you had never left your hometown. It was simple, satisfying, and used pantry ingredients that kept forever. For families trying to save money without falling into a rut, canned fish curry was a flavorful detour from the usual meat and potatoes fare. It was humble, yes, but never dull. Beef tongue with raisin sauce might sound shocking today, but it was once considered a delicacy on par with the finest roasts. The tongue would be simmered low and slow until tender, peeled, sliced, and then draped in a sweet and sour raisin sauce made with vinegar, sugar, and spices. It had a rich, velvety texture that absorbed flavor like nothing else. In the 1950s, frugality and flavor went hand in hand, and tongue was an economical cut that delivered both. It was often served at Sunday dinners or special occasions, especially in households that prided themselves on nose-to-tail cooking. The raisin sauce gave it just enough sweetness to offset the meat's richness, turning something unfamiliar into something comforting. You could serve it with mashed potatoes, buttered noodles, or just a big slice of crusty bread. It was the kind of dish that asked you to be brave and then rewarded you for it. Mashed potato casserole with cheese and peas was the unofficial answer to what to do with last night's leftovers. You would layer mashed potatoes in a dish, top them with sweet peas, usually canned or frozen, and then sprinkle cheddar cheese over the top before baking it until golden and bubbling. It was rich and creamy, but also light enough to count as a full meal. In the 1950s, this kind of casserole was a staple on dinner tables across the country. It used what you had, wasted nothing, and tasted like something much fancier than it really was. Kids loved the peas, adults appreciated the convenience, and everyone went back for seconds. It was a true one-dish wonder, the kind of recipe you could prep in 10 minutes and have ready just in time for the 6 o'clock news. There was no fanfare, just warmth, comfort, and full bellies. Old-timey chicken croquettes were what happened when you had leftover chicken and a little creativity. The meat would be finely chopped or ground, mixed with breadcrumbs, seasonings, and sometimes a white sauce or gravy to hold it all together. Then the mixture was shaped into patties or little cylinders, rolled in more breadcrumbs, and fried until golden brown. They were crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, and always served with even more gravy or a splash of lemon juice. In the 1950s, croquettes were a smart way to stretch a small amount of chicken into a full dinner. They were neat, tidy, and easy to serve, which made them perfect for busy families and Sunday leftovers alike. Some versions had a little onion or celery inside, others stayed plain and classic. Either way, they had that old-school diner vibe, hearty, familiar, and filling. You would eat two and already be planning on heating up the rest tomorrow. Ham and scalloped apples was one of those rare dishes that made sweet and savory work together in perfect balance. You would lay thick slices of ham in a baking dish and surround them with peeled apple slices tossed in brown sugar, cinnamon, and a splash of vinegar or lemon juice. Then you would bake it all together until the apples were soft and caramelized, and the ham had soaked up just enough of that sweetness. It was a showstopper on the table, not just because it smelled like a holiday, but because it brought flavors together in a way that just worked. In the 1950s, this was a favorite for Sunday dinners and potlucks, especially when you needed something that felt festive without breaking the budget. The apples made the meat go further, and the whole thing paired perfectly with mashed potatoes or fresh rolls. It was easy, it was clever, and it always left people asking for the recipe. Bacon-wrapped meatloaf slices were what happened when someone decided the only way to improve meatloaf was to add more meat. Instead of one big loaf, you would shape individual mini loaves or thick slices, then wrap each one in a strip of bacon before baking. The bacon crisped up around the edges and kept everything moist inside, while adding that smoky flavor everyone craved. In the 1950s, meatloaf was already a family favorite, but this version took it to a whole new level. It looked fancier, it tasted richer, and it made even picky eaters clean their plates. You could add a little ketchup glaze if you liked, or just let the bacon do the talking. Either way, it was a meal that felt like a reward after a long day. You did not need a holiday to make it. You just needed a pound of ground beef, a few strips of bacon, and a reason to smile at dinner time. Creamed dried beef and noodles was one of those meals that felt humble but hit the spot every time. Instead of the usual toast, the salty slivers of dried beef were folded into a thick buttery cream sauce and poured over egg noodles that had been cooked just shy of soft. The noodles gave it body, the sauce gave it weight, and the beef, well, that was the punch of flavor that made it all feel like something special. In the 1950s, this was a step up from chipped beef on toast, something you could serve at dinner instead of just breakfast. It was rich without being expensive and filling without being fussy. People loved how fast it came together and how easy it was to dress up with a dash of paprika or some frozen peas. This was the kind of dish that showed up on busy weeknights and stuck around long after because it just made sense. No need for anything fancy when something this simple could leave you so full. Baked potato boats with sausage and cheese were dinner disguised as fun. You would bake up big russet potatoes until the skins were crisp and the insides were soft, then cut them open and scoop them out. Mix the potato with browned sausage, sautéed onions, and a handful of sharp cheddar, then refill the shells and bake again until golden. It looked like a snack. It ate like a meal. In the 1950s, this was a clever way to stretch a little meat into a full plate, especially for families with growing kids and limited budgets. The beauty was in the balance: rich cheese, savory sausage, buttery potato, and a crispy shell to hold it all together. You could serve it with a salad, a cup of soup, or nothing at all. It was neat, it was easy, and it always got cleaned off the plate. There was something satisfying about scooping into those little boats, like digging into something homemade and just a little indulgent. Spanish rice with ground beef was the one skillet wonder that made cleanup easy and dinner even easier. You would start by browning beef in a skillet with diced onions, then toss in rice, canned tomatoes, bell peppers, and some seasoning, maybe chili powder, garlic salt, or a little cumin if you were feeling adventurous. Add water, let it all simmer, and 20 minutes later, you had something steaming, colorful, and hearty enough to keep everyone quiet at the table. In the 1950s, this was known as the busy cook's best friend. It was inexpensive, it was quick, and it tasted better the next day, which meant leftovers were not just tolerated. They were welcome. It had just enough spice to feel bold, but not enough to scare off picky eaters. Moms loved it, dads loved it, and kids usually went back for more. You could top it with shredded cheese, stir in some corn, or spoon it into tortillas for a next day lunch. But most of the time, it was served straight from the skillet to the plate, no extras needed. Green bean and cheese bake was where vegetables stopped pretending and started showing up as dinner. You would take canned or fresh green beans, mix them with cream sauce or condensed soup, fold in shredded cheddar, and bake until everything was bubbling and browned on top. It was thick, gooey, and absolutely covered in cheese, which was kind of the point. In the 1950s, casseroles like this turned vegetables into main courses, especially in meat-light households trying to stretch the budget. This dish had staying power. It was rich without being too heavy, and it came together fast, especially when most of the ingredients came straight from the pantry. If you had a can opener and a casserole dish, you had dinner. You could top it with breadcrumbs, cracker crumbs, or those little fried onions that were always hiding in the back of the cabinet. It was creamy, salty, and packed with just enough green to make it feel like a smart choice. Oven barbecued bologna slices were what happened when you wanted the taste of barbecue but had no grill and no ribs. You would take thick rounds of bologna, score the tops so they curled at the edges, slather them in a sweet and smoky sauce, and broil them until the edges charred just right. The result was sticky, crispy, and surprisingly satisfying. In the 1950s, bologna was cheap, filling, and always on hand. This recipe gave it new life. It was diner food turned dinner food, dressed up just enough to feel like something new. The sauce, usually ketchup, brown sugar, mustard, and a splash of vinegar, soaked into every slice and made each bite better than the last. Served with baked beans, coleslaw, or buttered white bread, it was a full meal that cost next to nothing. And no one ever complained. Sometimes people would top it with pineapple rings or melt cheese over the top to give it extra flair. It was smoky without smoke, bold without effort, and comforting without complication. Bologna might have been seen as humble, but on nights like this, it felt like something worth celebrating. Cornbread-topped chicken stew was a bubbling dish of comfort that worked from the bottom up. You would simmer bits of chicken, carrots, peas, and onions in a thick gravy, then pour it all into a casserole dish and spread a layer of cornbread batter right over the top. Once it hit the oven, something magical happened. The cornbread rose, turned golden, and cracked just slightly, letting the steam escape from the bubbling stew beneath. It was part pot pie, part casserole, and all heart. In the 1950s, this kind of dinner was a point of pride. It made something humble feel homemade and complete. The cornbread soaked up just enough of the broth to be moist but not soggy, and the sweet crust gave every bite a contrast that kept you going back for more. Some cooks added a sprinkle of cheddar or diced green chilies to the cornbread for extra warmth. It was the kind of meal you made once and kept making because it worked, on busy weeknights, cold Sundays, or any time you needed food to do more than just fill a plate. Macaroni and egg salad bake was a quirky twist on two familiar dishes that somehow worked better together than apart. You would take elbow macaroni and fold it into a creamy mixture of chopped hard-boiled eggs, mustard, mayonnaise, and just a touch of relish or vinegar. Then you would scoop it into a baking dish, top it with a little cheese or buttery breadcrumbs, and bake until it was warm through and golden on top. What hit the table was strange but comforting, like a picnic side turned inside out and made into something more substantial. In the 1950s, this kind of creativity came from necessity. You had to make use of pantry staples and leftovers, and this dish did just that. It was cool in theory, warm on the plate, and never boring. Some families added diced celery or canned tuna to stretch it further. Others leaned into the richness and served it just as it was. It fed a lot of people with very little, and it made you feel like you had cooked something thoughtful. That is what made it memorable. Veal patties and onion gravy were the kind of meal that made you feel like you were eating high on the hog, without spending the money to do it. Ground veal was mixed with breadcrumbs, egg, and just enough seasoning to hold together, then formed into thick patties and browned in a hot pan. Once they had a good crust, sliced onions were added to the same skillet and cooked until soft, picking up every bit of flavor left behind. A splash of broth or stock turned it into a full pan gravy, and the patties were nestled back in to simmer until tender. In the 1950s, veal was still affordable, and it was seen as a step up from beef or pork. This dish made good on that promise. The patties were soft, the gravy rich, and the onions practically melted into the sauce. You would spoon it over mashed potatoes or buttered noodles and sit back like it was Sunday supper, even if it was just Wednesday night. It was one of those meals where nobody talked much because they were too busy eating. Ham and potato scallop was one of the most beloved casseroles of the 1950s, and with good reason. Thinly sliced potatoes were layered in a baking dish with chunks of cooked ham, slivers of onion, and a creamy sauce that brought it all together. The sauce could be homemade or come from a can, it did not really matter. What mattered was how it bubbled and browned in the oven, how the edges turned crispy, and how the inside stayed soft and savory. Every bite was a little salty from the ham, a little peppery from the sauce, and completely satisfying. Some families added shredded cheese to the top, others sprinkled breadcrumbs. Some made it with cream, others with condensed soup. But however it was made, it filled the house with the smell of something you wanted to wait for. This was the kind of meal that made people slow down. It was filling, familiar, and made out of the things almost every family had on hand. And once it hit the table, there were rarely leftovers. Fish stick casserole was the shortcut dinner that made life a little easier for working moms and growing families. You would start by lining a baking dish with frozen fish sticks, then add canned peas or corn, dollops of mashed potatoes, and a generous handful of shredded cheese. Some people poured on a little cream sauce or tomato soup to bring it all together. Then it went into the oven until everything was bubbling and golden. The top was crispy, the inside warm and soft, and the whole thing felt like something more than the sum of its parts. In the 1950s, frozen food was still new enough to feel exciting, and fish sticks were one of the decade's biggest innovations. This casserole turned them into a meal instead of a snack. Kids loved it. Parents loved how quick it was. And no one had to argue about what was for dinner. It was not fancy. It was not impressive. But it was exactly what a busy night needed. Spam and egg scramble was one of those 10-minute dinners that showed up again and again when times got lean. You diced up a can of Spam, fried it in a hot skillet until the edges curled and crisped, then scrambled in a few eggs with onions if they were around. It all came together fast, filled your plate, and made sure nobody went to bed hungry. Spam was a pantry staple for a reason. Cheap, shelf-stable, and surprisingly versatile. The old cookbooks were full of ways to stretch it into something that felt like a real meal. Toss in eggs, and suddenly, dinner looked good enough to serve without apology. It was salty, hearty, and loaded with that familiar taste of making do with what you had. Families leaned on quick meals like this because they worked. 10 minutes on the stove, a hot plate in front of everyone, and dinner was done. No one claimed it was fancy, but when your pantry was empty and the paycheck still days away, it tasted like a small victory. Funny how those simple, practical meals stuck with us. They filled the gaps and filled us up. In times of hectic schedules, a savory bowl of noodles can feel like an instant remedy for dinnertime stress. With 10-minute stir-fried noodles, there is minimal chopping, easy cleanup, and undeniable flavor. Speed is paramount here. People balancing work and family can still enjoy a hearty meal. Historically, noodles have held a revered place in Asian cuisine, with archaeologists finding the earliest examples in China over 4,000 years ago. This updated recipe calls for quick-cooked noodles, fresh vegetables, and a splash of soy sauce, culminating in a meal both satisfying and straightforward. Some home cooks joke that stir-frying is the official sport of last-minute dinners, praising its capacity to salvage any leftover produce. Texture remains a hallmark, combining crisp, tender vegetables with pleasantly chewy noodles. Nostalgia factors in as many recall the era when simple stir-fries gained traction in American kitchens during the 1970s. Meanwhile, accessibility stands out since few specialized ingredients are required and the entire process relies on a single pan. When tomato sauce wasn't in the pantry and butter wasn't an option, a surprising combination stepped in: mayonnaise and mustard. Tossed with hot spaghetti noodles and seasoned with a dash of salt and pepper, this unusual pairing became a quick-fix meal known as Mayo and mustard spaghetti, which was both budget-friendly and undeniably memorable. Spaghetti itself was one of the most affordable dry goods available, filling enough to feed a family without requiring much else. Mayonnaise, often stocked in refrigerators for sandwiches and salads, brought richness and a creamy texture, while mustard added just enough tang to keep things interesting. It wasn't gourmet, but it turned plain pasta into something that felt like a complete dish without the need for meat, cheese, or expensive sauces. In working-class households, meals like this weren't about following a recipe. They were about making do with what was available. Kids grew up eating it straight from the pot, a quick meal before heading outside to play or finishing homework at the kitchen table. It may not have been a dinner guests would rave about, but for those who remember it, the taste still lingers as a reminder of simpler times and just how far a few basic ingredients could go. Biscuits and sausage gravy. Okay. This southern staple might still be a thing in some parts of the country, but let's be real, biscuits and sausage gravy is definitely not dominating breakfast menus anymore. I guess waffles are to blame for that. But this breakfast legend is the perfect combination of fluffy buttermilk biscuits so light and airy they practically melt in your mouth, along with a creamy sausage gravy, rich with savory sausage and speckled with black pepper. This is a breakfast, or hey, no judgment here, even a dinner combination that's pure comfort food heaven. From the perfect hangover cure to a delicious weekend treat, biscuits and sausage gravy satisfy all cravings. Just maybe lay off the white clothes while you're indulging. That sausage gravy can be a bit enthusiastic when it comes to staining. Baked apples with honey were such an incredible medieval dish that they were especially for any kind of party or celebration. The baking was always done near the fire or a hearth oven, and the dish was incredibly simple. It really was just an apple that was baked whole with honey drizzled over it, or sometimes they would simply dip the whole thing in honey. People would also boil the apples first and then bake them to get a dish that resembled the texture of apple pudding as we know it today. This dish was eaten at the end of a course or as a fast day meal, and honey and apples were things that you could eat on days where you had to fast. The combination of a softened, decadent apple mixed in with caramelized golden honey was something that scratched all the right itches. Baked apples with honey had an incredibly strong association with festive and seasonal meals, and they were particularly really popular around harvest and Christmas. Apples were abundant, and honey was something that people could spare sometimes for the right kind of occasion. This dish is something you see in medical texts, estate records, cookbooks, and other medieval-era references. Apples were also prized because of how easy they were to store. Break time. 1 second. Leftover turkey was once the foundation of creative home cooking. Long before frozen dinners and deli slices, resourceful cooks found ways to repurpose every part of a roasted bird. One of the most inventive solutions? A golden, bubbling gratin that transformed shredded turkey into something just as satisfying as the holiday feast itself. Sweet potatoes, naturally rich and slightly sweet, paired perfectly with the savory depth of turkey. Thinly sliced and layered, they acted as both a starch and a built-in flavor enhancer. A cheesy herbed cream sauce seeped into every bite, bringing a velvety richness that made this dish feel indulgent despite its humble origins. Some families added a pinch of nutmeg for warmth, while others topped it with breadcrumbs for a golden, crispy finish. For decades, this dish was a practical way to extend a meal and avoid food waste. Turkey was affordable, especially in the days when whole birds were purchased rather than pre-packaged cuts. Sweet potatoes, widely available and inexpensive, provided both nutrition and flavor. As quick-fix meals and processed leftovers became the norm, dishes requiring careful layering and slow baking lost their appeal. For generations, lamb was a prized centerpiece of homecoming feasts and holiday gatherings. Its deep, rich flavor and fall-apart tenderness made it a dish reserved for special occasions, especially in families with European or Mediterranean roots. Scalloped chicken casserole. Here's another classic casserole that deserves a comeback. This dish is the perfect example of simple but mouth-watering good. I mean, just imagine tender chicken pieces in a creamy sauce, seasoned to perfection, and layered with fluffy breadcrumbs. I think I'm feeling hungry now. Scalloped chicken casserole is a great way to use up leftover chicken, and it's perfect for a quick and easy weeknight meal. Not to mention, it's a dish that's sure to please even the pickiest eaters. Who can resist creamy chicken and crispy breadcrumbs? Ditch your takeout menus for a night and take a trip down memory lane by giving this casserole a try. You can find dozens of recipes on the internet, and it won't take you hours to whip up. Trust me, your taste buds will thank you. Scrapple was traditionally a way to use up leftover pork scraps, but when meat was scarce or too expensive, another version took its place, one that relied on sweet potatoes and cornmeal instead. Sweet potato scrapple kept the same fried, crispy on the outside, soft on the inside texture, but swapped out meat for mashed sweet potatoes, mixed with cornmeal and spices, then molded into a loaf and sliced before frying. It was simple, cheap, and packed with enough flavor to make you forget there wasn't any pork in sight. Sweet potatoes were a southern staple, affordable, nutritious, and easy to grow. Unlike white potatoes, they had a natural sweetness that made them versatile in both savory and sweet dishes. Combined with cornmeal, another low-cost kitchen essential, they created a filling, hearty meal that could be eaten on its own or served with eggs for breakfast. Seasonings varied by household. Some added cinnamon for warmth, others leaned into salt and pepper for a more savory bite. Families who grew up eating it remember the unmistakable sound of slices sizzling in a hot pan, the edges crisping up to golden perfection. In many kitchens, the comforting aroma of a steamy bowl conjures memories of simpler evenings shared with loved ones. Instant tomato soup, a swift solution for hungry families, gained considerable momentum when processed foods took off in the early 20th century. Culinary historians point to its rising popularity as a prime example of how convenience foods dominated American pantries. Despite its rapid preparation time, the soup's smooth texture and mildly tangy flavor still deliver satisfying warmth that appeals to palates of all ages. Those who relish nostalgia might remember cozying up with a hot mug after a long day, while busy professionals champion its speed and convenience. Interestingly, tomatoes supply a generous helping of vitamin C, making this option more than just comfort in a cup. Some folks even joke that it's the Red Rescue, swooping in to save anyone from a dull dinner crisis. Simplicity and accessibility guide the entire process. Boil water, stir in tomato base, and add a dash of seasoning if desired. The result is a bowl of soothing familiarity that Americans often link with childhood memories. This timeless staple also leaves room for creative flair, whether swirling in a hint of cream or pairing it with crackers. Quick tomato egg drop soup was a fast, practical dinner that showed up in old cookbooks for families juggling tight grocery budgets and tighter schedules. You started with hot broth, usually whatever bouillon cube or soup base you had in the cupboard. Then you poured in canned tomatoes and stirred everything together until it simmered. The final touch was whisked eggs, slowly dripped in as you stirred, turning into silky ribbons in the hot broth. It looked a little fancier than it was, but this meal was all about speed and making the best of what you had. The tomatoes added sweetness, the broth made it filling, and the eggs gave enough protein to keep everyone going. It came together in less than 10 minutes and cost next to nothing, which is exactly why old cookbooks loved it. It was warm, fast, and comforting without much effort. Families leaned on meals like this because they filled bellies and stretched paychecks at the same time. Funny how those quick little soup tricks turned into classics that still stick with people. On sweltering summer days, a crisp and refreshing side wins hearts with minimal fuss. Thinly sliced cucumbers tossed in a tangy dressing highlight how speed and convenience can merge seamlessly with satisfying taste. Historians trace cucumber cultivation back over 3,000 years, with evidence in ancient India, though the tradition of quickly pickling them for salads gained traction much later. Food enthusiasts joke that this dish is the best way to turn a watery green vegetable into a bona fide star at potlucks. Each bite offers a cool snap balanced by a delicate vinegar kick, creating a pleasing contrast in both flavor and texture. The process remains remarkably straightforward. Slice, season, stir, and serve. This simplicity and accessibility make it appealing for busy households, ensuring that even novice cooks can achieve a crowd-pleasing result. Some add onions, others incorporate dill or a pinch of sugar for extra zest, reflecting how flexible this old favorite can be. Indeed, cucumbers contain a high water content, which supports hydration, practical for those warm months when thirst quenching is essential. In working-class kitchens, the best meals weren't always planned. They were thrown together with whatever was available. A pound of ground beef, a can of tomatoes, some diced potatoes, and a handful of elbow macaroni could turn into a thick, hearty stew that stuck to your ribs and stretched across multiple meals. Some called it Slumgulion, others just called it dinner. Dishes like this had no strict recipe, just a basic formula, cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable. One night it might be heavy on potatoes, the next, macaroni took center stage. Some families added onions for flavor, while others bulked it up with beans or whatever vegetables were left in the fridge. The name Slumgulion had been around since the 1800s, used by miners and sailors to describe a hodgepodge meal, proof that resourceful cooking had always been part of survival. Ground beef was one of the most affordable proteins in the 1960s, and canned tomatoes provided flavor without the cost of fresh produce. With a simple pot and a little seasoning, this one-dish meal fed entire families with ease. It was the kind of food that tasted even better the next day, reheated on the stove after a long shift or a day at school. Comfort food without the price tag. I can just imagine the satisfying experience of cutting through that tender beef with minimal effort. Swiss steak, a dinnertime classic that deserves a comeback. Where do I sign the petition? Lamb might seem like a fancy restaurant thing these days, but back in the day, it was a total dinnertime MVP. Lamb stew was a fan favorite at dinner parties back in the day, and I get the hype. Imagine the combination of melt-in-your-mouth lamb and an assortment of colorful vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and peas simmered in a rich, flavorful broth just begging to be soaked with some crusty bread. This is a dish that's guaranteed to warm you up from the inside out on a chilly day. Not to mention, it's surprisingly easy to make. Perfect for those nights when you want a delicious meal without spending hours in the kitchen. Just maybe don't tell your grandma you added a sprinkle of your favorite hot sauce. Some traditions are best left untouched. Slow roasting a lamb shoulder with garlic and fresh herbs was a time-honored tradition. Lamb was once far more common on American dinner tables than it is today. In the early 20th century, it was an affordable alternative to beef and pork, particularly in rural areas where small-scale farming was the norm. Shoulder cuts were especially budget-friendly, benefiting from long, slow cooking to break down tough fibers. Roasted low and slow with rosemary, thyme, and whole cloves of garlic, the meat absorbed deep, aromatic flavors while becoming melt-in-your-mouth tender. So why did it disappear from everyday meals? As industrial farming shifted American preferences toward beef and chicken, lamb fell out of favor. It became harder to find in grocery stores, and for many home cooks, its distinctive flavor was an acquired taste. Faster, more convenient proteins replaced slow-cooked roasts, and over time, this once popular dish faded into obscurity. Poor people would have very limited options for food back then. While you might think that since there weren't any taxes, jobs, or grocery store price bumps to worry about, that doesn't necessarily mean it was easier. They had to rely on whatever they could forage, whatever they could grow, and whatever was easiest to buy. Oat Grl was a dish that basically became synonymous with being down on your luck because of this. Oats have, for centuries, been the silver lining in a deeply hungry and bad situation for a lot of people. But that was especially true during medieval times. Oat Grl is pretty much prison food, too. Ever see those shows where the guy gets a porridge-looking slope of food? That's pretty much it. While it was nutritious and it had protein, the biggest reason people ate it was because of the amounts of fiber present in it. It would keep them full for much longer in the day and lead to less hunger pangs, but it also meant that they were continuously losing body fat without being able to make too much muscle. We're really starting to explore the deep end of medieval countryside cuisine now, so I hope you're still tuned. Our next item happens to be turnip stew, which is a textbook example of how people got their nutrition in those times. Potatoes were not actually the most widespread ingredient like they are today. It used to be turnips. This was especially true for Europe, where potatoes arrived by the 16th century. Turnips were favored because they could be preserved very easily in root cellars for winter. They were really easy to grow in poor soils, and they were hardy. Also, this was one of the few crops where even its root was edible. It wasn't a dish that had a lot of guidelines to follow, so in that respect it was a lot similar to how pottage worked. People would throw in whatever herbs, roots, aromatics, and scraps of meat and protein they had. One of the best things that would go along with turnip stew if it was available was beetroot and eggplant, which might be a surprise combination for you to hear, but was actually fairly common back then. During mid-century potlucks, families often relied on pantry staples to whip up vibrant dishes at a moment's notice. This colorful medley typically combined different canned beans, chopped onions, and a simple vinaigrette, celebrating speed and convenience above all else. Culinary historians credit post-war marketing campaigns with popularizing the humble bean mix, as home cooks saw it as a thrifty and reliable way to feed guests quickly. The sweet and sour tang, balanced by the satisfying texture of tender beans, continues to evoke nostalgia for summertime picnics and cheerful backyard gatherings. Many laud its simplicity and accessibility, noting that nothing more than a can opener and a basic chopping board is required. Some households toss in bell peppers or celery for crunch, while others prefer a sprinkling of herbs to add brightness. Flavor and texture remain paramount, Each bite merges the mild creaminess of beans with the zesty snap of onions and vinegar. A few comedic fans joke that bean salad is the ultimate test of group etiquette. There's always that one person who can't resist more helpings, and they're not shy about it. Eggs and milk, two of the most basic ingredients in any 1960s kitchen, were the foundation of a meal that felt more like a science experiment than dinner. Floating island dinner, as it was sometimes called, involved poaching eggs in a thin milk broth, then serving them over toast with a dusting of paprika. It was cheap, it was filling, and while it may have looked unusual, it made the most of what families had on hand. Eggs were a working-class staple, packed with protein and relatively inexpensive compared to meat. Poaching them in milk was a way to add richness without using butter or oil, and the broth itself didn't go to waste. It soaked into the toast, creating a soft, custard-like texture that was surprisingly satisfying. Paprika wasn't just for color. It added a hint of warmth and spice to an otherwise mild dish. This kind of meal had roots in old-fashioned frugality. Similar recipes had been around for generations, passed down from an era when every ingredient had to serve a purpose. For kids, it was a bit of a mystery. Why was dinner floating? But for parents, it was an easy, one-pan solution that turned a few simple staples into something warm and nourishing at the end of a long day. Don't you love low-effort foods where you can just throw in the ingredients and let your slow cooker do all the work? Well, you would have loved Festive slow-cooked beef tips. As the name suggests, this one was a favorite at festive dinner parties and people couldn't stop raving about it. It's very simple, too. Tender beef tips simmered low and slow in a savory sauce brimming with flavor. You can customize the sauce to your liking. Add some red wine for a touch of sophistication, or maybe ranch if you aren't feeling fancy. No judgment here. Festive slow-cooked beef tips are perfect for a busy weeknight or a casual weekend gathering. Just pop it in the slow cooker before you head out the door and come home to a delicious meal waiting for you. Once a staple of working-class kitchens, this hearty one-dish meal was built on the kind of ingredients that stretched a family's budget without sacrificing flavor. Cabbage, potatoes, and smoked sausage, three of the most economical and widely available foods, came together in layers, baked slowly in a rich mustard cream sauce. The result was a rustic, deeply satisfying dish that filled bellies and kept families warm through colder months. Cabbage was a practical ingredient, valued for its long shelf life and versatility. When paired with smoky seasoned sausage and starchy potatoes, it created a meal that was both inexpensive and packed with flavor. The mustard-infused cream sauce added a tangy richness, tying everything together. Some home cooks added a dash of vinegar for brightness, while others incorporated cheese for extra indulgence. No matter the variation, this dish was proof that humble ingredients could create something truly special. Why did it fall out of favor? The rise of prepackaged meals and low-carb trends made cabbage-heavy dishes less common, and as quick stovetop meals replaced slow-baked casseroles, this once popular dish faded from view. Barley bread is one of the oldest kinds of loaded breads that you can find in European history. It's completely medieval and has a history that goes back thousands of years. This is because among all the grains in the world, barley is arguably one of the first that we ever domesticated. It was first cultivated in the Fertile Crescent, which, if you don't know where that is, it's the area that covers modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. Barley bread was one of the most common kinds of bread in the early Middle Ages, and it went onwards towards the High Middle Ages as well. This was typically considered to be a peasant bread, though. It had a coarse texture, it was darker than other breads, and it did not really have enough gluten. It was hard bread because of that fact. It was actually a bit of a sign of your economic class if you were constantly having barley bread, because only the rich people would get to eat fluffy white loaves of bread like we're used to. Minute rice with canned chili and cheese was the dinner of champions. If your definition of champion was someone who worked 12 hours and still had to put food on the table. That old minute rice box was a lifeline back then, cooking up fluffy in just a few minutes. You dumped canned chili right over the top, shredded some cheddar if you had it, and dinner was done. Nobody expected it to be gourmet, but it filled you up, stuck to your ribs, and made sure you were ready for the next shift, the next chore, the next whatever life threw at you. The cookbooks from those days leaned hard on pantry meals like this because they worked. They were honest, quick dinners that kept you standing, even when life tried to knock you down. And hey, melted cheese makes everything better. Not every seafood dish came from the ocean. Some came straight from a can. In a time when fresh shrimp was a luxury for coastal towns, canned shrimp offered an affordable way for working-class families to bring a little seafood into their diets. Mixed with peas in a thick, creamy white sauce and served over crackers or toast, this dish had a playful name, Shrimp Wiggle. But it was all business when it came to stretching ingredients. Canned shrimp had been around since the early 20th century, marketed as a convenient alternative to fresh shellfish. By the 1960s, it found its way into all kinds of home-cooked meals, from salads to casseroles. In this dish, it was combined with a simple white sauce, a budget-friendly staple made from butter, flour, and milk that turned just about anything into a filling, stick-to-your-ribs meal. The peas added a pop of color and a bit of sweetness, balancing out the richness of the sauce. Served over saltines or toasted white bread, it wasn't fancy, but it was warm, comforting, and familiar. For many kids, it was their first introduction to seafood, whether they liked it or not. Some remember it fondly, while others never quite warmed up to the idea of shrimp that came from a can. Hard cheese and bread is one of the oldest and most memorable pairings from the medieval period, and bread and cheese were some of the most core meals for people back then. It wasn't even a specific group of people, it was almost everyone. Monks, shepherds, travelers, nomads, farmers, fishermen, peasants, and even citizens. Bread would be made using whatever kind of grains were possibly available, and they were the typical ones we have gone over so far. If you were rich, you would just be eating wheat, and that was always a dead giveaway that you were rich too. The class disparity back then was pretty black and white. In the middle and lower classes, as they existed back then, you would get to see several different kinds of breads, like dark and rough ones, or fluffy but dense ones. Hard cheese was something that was favored over other kinds of dairies because it could be stored for a very long period without spoiling anything. Cheesemaking was something that was an extremely rural activity, and it was practiced in all kinds of homes, monasteries, and farms. Milk from sheep would be curdled via rennet and pressed, then salted and aged to make firm cheese. It was a practice that would go on throughout France, Switzerland, and even England. Slow cooking was once a necessity, not a luxury. Before pressure cookers and pre-packaged meals, tougher cuts of beef were transformed through hours of gentle simmering, unlocking deep, rich flavors. This smoky Chipotle beef ragu was one such dish, a meal that took time but rewarded patience with melt-in-your-mouth tenderness. Chipotle peppers, known for their earthy heat, were a staple in traditional Mexican and Southwestern cooking, but by the mid-20th century, their smoky kick found its way into American kitchens. Paired with tomatoes, garlic, and slow-braised beef, this dish delivered a bold, layered flavor that stood apart from ordinary pot roasts. Served over creamy polenta or even buttered noodles, it was both comforting and deeply satisfying. Despite its rich taste, this meal was surprisingly budget-friendly. Beef chuck or brisket, once some of the most affordable cuts, became tender and flavorful when cooked low and slow. The sauce was built from pantry staples, making it an easy, accessible choice for home cooks. But over time, as quick weeknight meals took priority and polenta lost ground to pasta and rice, this dish faded from dinner tables. Today, Chipotle has seen a resurgence in trendy restaurants, but this home-style beef ragu remains a forgotten classic. Bologna wasn't just for sandwiches. When money was tight and meat had to be stretched, it found its way into all kinds of meals, including breakfast, where it was ground up, fried, and turned into a creamy, savory gravy. Poured over biscuits or a few slices of white bread, ground Bologna gravy took one of the cheapest meats on the market and transformed it into something warm, filling, and satisfying. Bologna had long been a go-to protein for working-class families. Made from a mix of leftover meat trimmings, it was significantly cheaper than fresh cuts of beef or pork, but still packed enough flavor to carry a dish. Frying it first gave it a crispy, caramelized edge, while the addition of milk and flour turned it into a rich, hearty gravy. Served over whatever bread was available, it became a meal that could keep a family going through the day. For those who grew up eating it, the smell of sizzling bologna in a cast-iron skillet brings back memories of weekend breakfasts and weekday suppers alike. It wasn't fancy, but that wasn't the point. It was resourcefulness at its best, a way to take something simple and turn it into comfort food with just a few basic ingredients and a little time at the stove. In countless family kitchens, speedy rice pilaf stands as a testament to how resourcefulness can satisfy palates in minutes. Historically, pilaf traces back centuries to Middle Eastern and Central Asian cuisines, though it found renewed popularity across the United States as packaged convenience foods gained momentum in the 20th century. Some comedic observers say it's a dish that never retires, showcasing staying power in households across the country. At its core, this recipe relies on briefly sautéing onions in a dash of oil, then combining quick-cooking rice with flavorful spices, ensuring a well-rounded taste without prolonged stovetop watch. The resulting texture is fluffy yet distinct, offering a balance of softness and gentle bite that appeals to all ages. Nostalgia emerges when recalling mid-century TV commercials that championed instant rice, promising a perfect side dish ready faster than a station break. Today, home cooks still appreciate its no-fuss approach, which requires only basic ingredients and minimal monitoring. The convenience resonates with those juggling busy schedules, who often joke that any dish requiring more than 10 minutes conflicts with precious downtime. Craving more forgotten flavors? Drop your favorite in the comments, like the video, and subscribe for another helping of vintage comfort.